Former Senator Rod Kemp, former Assistant Treasurer, Minister for Culture, or some people used to call it fun in the Howard government. Thank you very much for coming along for a conversation with me today, and thank you for your service and a wonderful chapter that you've put into the book, Dignity and Prosperity, the Future of Liberal Australia. And your chapter, of course, is around the important topic of debt and deficit. And I'd just like to ask you a few questions about that. But in particular, let's perhaps go back and start when you took on the role. You know, early on, at the start of the Howard Costello period, the government inherited a secret large deficit and quite a lot of debt, 96 billion if I recall. So one of the questions that people ask now is, how difficult actually was it to undertake the fiscal reform necessary to bring the budget back into balance, and then it became a big surplus?
Well, I think the government made it very clear in the election period that the budget was out of control, although there was a bit of a black hole, if I remember rightly, that was kept secret. But we had two people who could actually give a very clear message to the wider public. Costello was wonderful at explaining issues, a great advocate, and was able to put a message to the public, and of course strongly backed up by the Prime Minister. And the budget that they brought down in '96, if I remember correctly, was very well received by the public. People understood that the government was taking very strong action, which needed to be taken. They'd been convinced by the arguments that had been put forward. Howard and Costello were able to bring about a very significant budget, which peeled back the growth of government expenditure, helped get rid of the structural deficit, and really set up the Howard years. And so they were able to resist the special interest groups, which were opposed to cuts in their particular area. And of course, they were able to deal with ministers that perhaps wanted spending to continue in particular areas.
Yeah. So I think it was close to 2% of GDP was the fiscal adjustment, and as you say, most of it came in the way of spending cuts. And you said how it set up the government, and I just wonder, how do you maintain first of all, you have to have the backbone to introduce fiscal discipline, but then to maintain it through all those years, because of course the budget went back into balance and surplus within 2 years, and then it ran in surplus, large surpluses in many cases, for the rest of the government, for another decade. And it would have been, I guess, very easy to have just let that go as time went on. So how do you think you maintain that, and what that says?
I think that Peter Costello had a great authority in the government, and any minister who'd been to the Expenditure Review Committee knew that he had to work hard, and on most occasions he was strongly backed in by the Prime Minister, and so as a team they worked extremely well together. But once you get rid of the structural deficit, and once the budget starts to roll into surplus, you're able to give significant benefits to people, particularly as we did with tax cuts.
Yes.
And so in a sense, we took the tough medicine in the early days, but dealing with the structural problems, and of course being benefited from terms of trade and other things, the government sort of continued in surplus all through the remainder of the Howard Costello years. So I think it was their natural authority. People knew they were prudent, and they were determined to deliver real benefits to families.
Yes. And in your chapter, you talk about the intergenerational question of debt, and you raise it actually in an ethical manner. I wonder if you'd like to just elaborate on why do you think not passing on debt to future generations is in fact an ethical question?
Well, you're passing on costs which should be properly borne by the current crop of taxpayers onto future taxpayers. And that means that the children and grandchildren, if these debts continue to run up, are going to have to experienced reduced standards of living on their own part. And of course, all the inhibiting factors that a high debt society brings, which we're starting to see now, actually, some of the results of that. So I think it is an ethical question, and the intergenerational report, which Costello initiated and brought down, was to try to raise this issue in the public mind, that it's not a free good, just borrowing and borrowing, and it's got to be paid back. And there is an ethical issue, is if you pass on your debts to future generations. So I think it is an important issue, and I do argue that in that chapter.
Yes, definitely. And I think there's some figures in there that the effect of the fiscal policies that the government ran during the Howard period were worth about $200 billion of additional debt that we would have had today were it not for that. So that's a very significant legacy when you think about the total size of debt that the country has. I wonder, though, when you look at the chapter, there were many benefits that flowed from sound fiscal policy. For instance, you mentioned just before tax reform and tax relief. And having been involved at the time, if you recall, one of the reasons tax reform was able to be done in 2000 was because the government had sufficient fiscal firepower, if you like, to make sure that they could spread relief across benefits, across the states, across the international economy to make us more competitive, and of course very much for households and for pensioners and the like. So perhaps you'd like to just let us know your thoughts on how do you manage sort of major reforms with sound fiscal policies, but also how can you do it if you don't have sound fiscal policies?
I think it's extremely hard, and it's always hard anyway with a sound fiscal position.
Yes.
We did find that. I used to say to the arts community in my 5 years as arts minister that they have a significant interest in budget surpluses, and they would say, why is that? I said, because it becomes easier for the government to do some of the important initiatives which you welcomed. And we were able to do that because the government position was a very strong financial position. We were able to establish the National Portrait Gallery. We were able to restructure the National Gallery of Australia. We had a major federation fund to assist the arts under Richard Alston's time. And so we had the money to do a few of those things because the budget was in a very sound position. And I think as the people are going to find that as the years go on under the current regime, is that a lot of these initiatives will not happen that the arts community and the cultural community want, because there isn't the money to do it.
Yes, no, well that certainly seems to be the case. As Margaret Thatcher used to say, the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. And Dan Andrews is quickly finding out that to be the case in Victoria, isn't he? He's quickly starting to run out of other people's money. So if you think about fiscal reform, I wonder how do you rate that in terms of how important that was for the Howard and Costello period of government? Because if you look at historically, that was very rare. We never had another government for such a long period of time running such strong fiscal policies.
I think that you should also note, of course, that when we made those sort of major reforms in taxation, that we had the Canadian experience in that period. And remember the Conservative Party in Canada that brought in the GST was almost wiped out in the following election.
Yes.
And that was undoubtedly the hope of the Labor Party in that time, was that we would follow the Canadians down that track. And it was a very high risk, but it was a very well-developed reform package that people could see the benefits that would come from it. And again, we had a very strong advocate in the Treasurer, that he was across the detail, and he could get out and he could sell it. And Howard sort of gave him enormously strong backing, and we managed to win what turned out to be a very close election. But that in the end set up, again, that period where, and it's one of the big reforms of the Howard government which has remembered, the tax reform and the GST.
Yes, for sure. So I wonder, ever since 2007, you left a $50 billion surplus, which 15 years ago, that's worth a lot more today, of course. But it was quickly dissipated by the incoming Labor government. And we've never really got back since, even though Jim Chalmers is trying to claim with some rather fudgy numbers that he's close, but he didn't hand down the budget to deliver that, I might add. So I wonder, though, how important do you think this should be as a policy platform for Liberals? Because we just had 9 years of Liberal coalition government, and they didn't deliver what Howard and Costello did during that period. They were more closer to what Fraser managed, which was almost to get to one.
Well, they had problems, of course, with the Senate, and there were the first budget of Abbott and Hockey, was a budget that was very ambitious in terms of fiscal management and control, but it was largely defeated from memory in the Senate, and unfortunately that seemed to take the steam out of the reform initiative, and I think. It was a big help to have such a detailed platform that was put forward. You can go back to Fight Back. I know that Fight Back, in a sense, was a bit of a disaster because, of course, in 1993 we lost the allegedly unlosable election to Keating. But Fight Back was a very important document, and it helped guide the Liberal Party thinking for the next decade and a half, actually. And I think many elements of the Howard government, could find their origins in that Fight Back philosophy.
Yeah, no, look, I agree completely. And it's interesting, and a number of contributors to the book and discussions have talked about how important Fight Back was. And in fact, Tony Abbott in his afterword mentions that specifically as something that helped set up the future Liberal win a term later and provide guidance for them to implement a platform, perhaps not all in one go, the Big Bang approach, but over many years.
But it did get up the significant issue of the GST, of course.
Yes.
I think it was at 15%. It was more than the GST we were proposing, and the various trade-offs which would come from that. Now, so although we didn't follow their figuring, we actually followed the philosophy, I think, and so there was a lot of preliminary work that was done that sort of helped mould Liberal thinking, and that gave us a bit of a momentum which Howard was able to pick up in his first term.
No, and I think Howard has said publicly not that long ago that in some ways it was it's a pity that the government had to compromise, which of course politics is about compromise, to get the final GST through the Senate, and of course food was taken out, a variety of other concessions were made which narrowed the base of the GST and made it less sustainable and also more complex, whereas the government had actually campaigned on taxing these things, lost all the seats, but then the Senate wouldn't respect their mandate. So I wonder, though, now it's been 23 years since those reforms happened. We really haven't had any significant reform, not in terms of broad personal income tax versus indirect tax reform since then. Do you think it's time to start revisiting the issue of tax reform and considering that as a plank for the future?
Well, I think tax reform always should be an important issue for Liberals, and particularly delivering tax relief to families. And I think that as taxes continue to mount rapidly, both at the state level and at the federal level, I think it's going to become more and more pressing as families find their family incomes squeezed by the increased taxes that we're seeing. And you can see the dilemma that the current government, Albanese government, is over the tax cuts which are due in a year's time. So we shall see what they deliver, of course, but it was a clear election promise.
The other part I find interesting about the period, and this doesn't capture the imagination as much as the public, but the new government introduced the Charter of Budget Honesty, of course, and the intergenerational report. But the effect of the changes it did, including the Independence Reserve Bank, that was done through exchange of letters between Peter Costello and the governor at the time, was, I believe, to increase transparency and accountability in our fiscal and institutional arrangements there. Since then, we seem to have backtracked. And even though we still have the charter in place, I think it became very clear in your chapter discusses this, that after Rudd came to office, there were a lot of fiscal tricks.
Yeah.
So they started to hide expenditure under the carpet, so to speak, because it was part of the headline deficit, but not the underlying deficit. And therefore the NBN, we've now seen it with some of these new funds that Albanese is proposing. And do you think now it's time to revisit proper transparency and accountability in the finances issue? Because, as I say, to me, it's like what I call Enron accounting. It's highly selective, hiding things off balance sheet or off the public face to pretend the budget's in a much better position than I think we all accept that in reality it's not very good position. It's still got a lot of debt being accumulated and a lot of deficit underneath it.
I think a little bit, not a little bit, a significant amount depends on the opposition and the vigour with which it's prepared to prosecute these matters. And I think that the public should certainly be reminded of these off-budget arrangements that the government has developed. I think you're quite right. I mean, what they're trying to do is to avoid the sort of the restrictions that were placed on government and the transparency, which Costello insisted on with the Charter of Budget Honesty. So I think the opposition, and that's why you need a very vigorous opposition that's prepared to take this battle up, so to keep on pointing these things out to the public, that what the government is doing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think some of these fiscal tricks, if you like, to try to fudge the numbers or hide the true state need to be better exposed. But one of the other suggestions that you've included in the chapter, and I find would be quite interesting, and something I think is very compelling, is a suggestion that things like the Charter of Budget Honesty be updated, but also include, for instance, a commitment as to when, over the term or the cycle, the budget would be returned to balance. If you believe it's important to do that, then it seems to me that makes sense to require a government to have to explain whether it can do that, and if it can, how, and if it can't, well, why not? And Treasury and Finance would make it clear that this government does not have a plan to return the budget. So I wonder if you'd like to just elaborate on, first of all, such a mechanism, why that would make sense, and also the importance of requiring governments to have to explain how they can return the budget.
I guess, like many people, I was rather stunned with the first Jim Chalmers effort at a budget. There was no sort of plan that was outlined to return the budget to surplus, and I think he got away with that. And it was because it was regarded as an interim budget, and of course the real budget was coming in May. But when you look at what he's done, is they've managed to sort of get themselves off the hook about explaining when we're going to return to a real surplus and deal with the structural problems in the budget. And we haven't got an answer to those questions yet. So, look, it depends, of course, on the independence of the Treasury officials and the finance officials, what they're prepared to state. And it's certainly asking a bit of them to do that if the government has no strategy to return to a budget surplus and sort of deal with the structural deficit. But look, it's one of those things which I think could produce some results and make sure the debate sort of swings back into an area which we think is important for the prosperity of the Australian economy.
Yes, and I think you note in your chapter as well, and other commentators, that this is probably the first Treasurer in a very long time who seems to have no commitment to returning the budget to surplus. If we look at his most recent budget, it makes it clear that he's just looking at deficits as far as the estimates go, and he's certainly got no plan to return it, but he also has no commitment to return
and
it.
I think that when you look further out, the parameters look a bit shaky too. So and there are certainly a few fiddles there, I think, with the Future Fund and other things that he's prepared to do. So I mean, he's been able to get away from the ground that was so carefully cultivated by Howard and Costello about fiscal responsibility. And I think it is important we return to it, because in the end, economics matters. If you don't run your economy properly, it is going to affect the prosperity of the nation and the living standards of families.
Elsewhere in the book, we talk about, you need a strong economy to deliver you strong finances, which then can pay for strong defence, and through that, obviously, the nation is protected. And I wonder what you see the relationship is between a strong economy and strong finances, and any suggestions you have about how we can improve those.
Well, it's terribly important for the prosperity of the nation, as I mentioned, and if we have this defence challenge, which I believe we do, I thought it was astonishing in the last budget that there was no real increase in defence expenditure. So every interest group seemed to have had some money sort of thrown their way, massive increases in social welfare spending, but defence, despite the rhetoric of the government about the significant defence challenges we face, there was no real increase in defence spending. And I think that underlines that it becomes very hard to do a lot of these things unless you've got your fiscal policy right. And it'll take time to get this right, but it's no sign under the previous government that they have the willingness to do it, and they have the understanding to do it. I mean, they seem to believe that they can spend all this money and suddenly they get surprised that inflation is going up.
Yes.
And then they get surprised that interest rates are going up. I mean, they seem to have completely forgotten the laws of economics.
Yes, well, that does seem to be very true by the Treasurer indeed. And in the context of looking at the fiscal policy, one of the things the commentariat particularly seem to be saying is, look, expenditure growth is inevitable. We just have to let the size of government continue to grow because we've got an ageing population, demands. But in reality, the government that you're a member of was able to buck the trend.
That's right.
And in fact, was not only held expenditure, but reduced expenditure throughout that period. I wonder, where do you see the relationship between, and where Liberals should be, between just letting revenue continue to grow as a way of trying to bring the deficit under control versus structurally addressing the spending side?
Well, we did in 1996. We addressed the expenditure side. We gave a high priority. In fact, I think most of the savings, as you've mentioned, in that budget came through expenditure restraint and savings in the budget. And so I think that's probably going to be the guiding principle. I mean, one of the major areas that's clearly causing significant budgetary problems is the NDIS. Now, people are very supportive of the NDIS, but they're not supportive of the massive growth that seems to be occurring. And there seems to be little willingness on the part of government, apart from the rhetoric, to actually do things which will attempt to bring the NDIS expenditure under greater control. And I noticed that Dutton has indicated in his budget reply speech that he's prepared to work with the government in a constructive way so that we can sort of deal with this massive pressure on the budget.
Coming back to the expenditure side, as you've mentioned the NDIS, and we've had, other than defence expenditure under this government, there's a lot of growth in other areas as well. And I wonder how much could be addressed through efficiency savings, but also perhaps through roles and responsibilities between different levels of government. Yeah. Do you see that's been a growth? Do you see things like, for instance, education, where we've spent an enormous amount of extra money through Gonski, and yet our results have gone backwards?
Yeah, well, it was quite predictable what was going to happen there, I'm afraid, that the arguments were put to David Gonski that what we needed to do was to improve the quality of teaching, not necessarily spend more and more money. And we opted to spend more and more money, and standards seem to have continued to decline. Now, certainly there's a COVID issue there and a school lockdown problem, but changing the sort of the roles of government, or working, on responsibilities, we're finding, I think, that a lot of the state governments have been very effective at passing responsibilities to the Commonwealth. And I think that's one of the problems with the NDIS, actually.
Yes.
And I think that was a deliberate design feature of the NDIS. And now I think the Labor government is ruining the day that they agreed to those changes. But you look in the health area, major issues there, the education area, which you mentioned. I think a significant issue is, of course, in the energy area. I mean, vast amounts of money are being spent there, and it's got to be questioned whether it's being spent in the most efficient way possible. And I would put forward the argument it's not, that we seem to be slow walking towards an energy crisis, certainly with prices and with forecasts of possible blackouts at Christmas, which is an astonishing failure of public policy, it's got to be said.
And we seem to now have huge amounts of subsidies, either direct payments from government to subsidise various interest groups in the energy space, or otherwise distorting the markets as well. So if we think about the economic side again of the fiscal policy, where do you think Liberals should be positioning themselves in terms of the size of government? Should they be putting in place caps or aspirations for where the size of government could go? Because without constraining it, it's very hard to bring down.
That was very effective under the Howard Costello regime. I mean, we did understand the importance of caps, and we did understand the importance of the size of government and to constrain government. But there's no doubt that if you get your fiscal position right, and you encourage business, you take unnecessarily regulations off business, the productivity with a sensible labour market reform can improve. You can do a lot of things without borrowing, and that's what the Howard government did. There were a lot of areas in government where expenditures were made which were very productive. Yes. And money wasn't wasted, but we could actually spend some money because of the strong fiscal position and getting our priorities right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. And finally, coming back to this question of the ethical side of it, Liberals are very reluctant to use language in terms of moral behaviour or ethical behaviour or things, and they tend to have become very focused, as I think Alexander Downer and John Howard talked about, managerial or administrative competence.
Yes, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about why it's important from a language perspective that Liberals talk about liberal principles in a much broader sense than just administrative or managerial
I think
competence?
Absolutely it's important. If we're going to appeal to younger people, I think we've got to watch our language, and the idea that you can just talk about being more efficient than Labor, I don't think cuts the mustard, to be quite frank. But I think if you encourage people to talk about individual liberties and freedoms, you're far more likely to strike a chord with the younger generation. And that's a real challenge for the Liberals. But it's important that the parliamentarians, this is why I congratulate you on your book, it's important that we understand what the philosophy is and how we talk about it. What have we learned from our history is very important. Yes. And there's an awful lot to be learnt there. And the Howard Costello government was truly a reformist government. And it knew what it wanted to do, and it was very effective at doing it. And for a variety of reasons, not all can be pinned back to individual responsibility of our leaders, during the subsequent Liberal governments. But I don't think that they were as good at promoting the philosophy and the rationale for their actions, and I think that was a pity.
Well, I guess we can only hope that more of them will read the book and absorb it and take some lessons for the future. So
Good.
Thank you very much, Rod, for joining me today.
Good, thank you, David.
Pleasure having you.